the infrastructure bill, inflation, and the OSHA vaccine mandate. I'm Adam Bearne, and this is the Square Circle. Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Adam Bearne. Joining us today are Libertarian Hunter DeRensis of Bring Our Troops Home. Hi, Hunter.
Hi, happy to be here.
And we also have progressive political reporter James Rosen. James, good to see you as always.
Thanks. Good to see you again, Adam.
And conservative Rachel Vindman of the Suburban Woman Problem podcast. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, welcome everyone. This week, President Biden scored a major victory when his $1.2 trillion, yes, with a T, infrastructure bill passed Congress. Here's ABC News with the story.
After 3 months of negotiations, missed deadlines, and that election loss in Virginia, the infrastructure bill will soon head to President Biden's desk. This is a rare bipartisan breakthrough in a bitterly divided Congress. The $1 trillion package is estimated to create 500,000 jobs over the next few years, and it promises significant investments in every pocket of the country, from how Americans commute, with $110 billion for highways, roads, and bridges, to protecting power outages with $65 billion to upgrade the nation's power grid. $39 billion in public transit, improving accessibility for people with disabilities, and $65 billion to expand internet, targeting rural areas and low-income communities. Plus, a $55 billion investment in clean water with money funneled to replace lead pipes and address water contamination. Now, of course, that's just one part of the president's agenda. Democrats will now move forward on the second part. That's that much larger social spending bill with funding for universal pre-K and for childcare. But with no Republican support for that package, the president will have to keep his party united. They're trying to get it done by Thanksgiving.
So, James Rosen, this bill passing, is it a vindication of President Biden's assertion that things can really be done in a bipartisan way in Washington?
Yes and no. It should have been done. I've said on this show on previous appearances, I think I've said 2 or 3 times that they never should have linked the infrastructure bill to the much larger relief bill. The progressives did that. They insisted they were basically holding the infrastructure bill hostage, even though the infrastructure bill had much broader support, including a number of Republicans. President Trump campaigned on spending a lot on the infrastructure, never got it done. And I think that what finally persuaded the squad and other progressives to de-link the 2 bills is the gubernatorial results in Virginia and New Jersey. I'm losing track of time. Last week, was it only? Governor Murphy, I think, barely won, or he's headed to a runoff. He won by 10 points 4 years ago. And former Governor McAuliffe in Virginia, trying to regain his seat, lost badly to a political unknown in Virginia. And I think that really sent shockwaves through Democratic leaders, and because they had left themselves open to attacks, fair or not, that President Biden was not making good on his campaign promises of competence, of bipartisanship to get things done. And so as a result of that, they finally de-linked the 2 bills and they passed the infrastructure bill. So it's good for President Biden. It's a major bill. Anyone who drives on our roads, as I do frequently, in our bridges, knows it's very much needed. So it's a victory, but it should have come, I don't know, 3-4 months ago.
Rachel Vindman, I'm sure you'll talk about the merits or otherwise of the bill, but what about this question of bipartisanship in Washington? Is it alive and well thanks to the infrastructure bill?
I do not think the infrastructure bill is, indicative of bipartisanship being alive and well. Quite the opposite. And I also think it shows as you can see, the squad, voting against it. I know the reasons for voting against it were a little bit more ideological. They thought that the social safety nets, the reconciliation bill should have been first. I don't necessarily disagree with that. While I don't agree with much of what the squad does, I can certainly appreciate that might have been a better place to start. I know for a lot of centrists like me, there's a lot of things in there that I think, as James pointed out, should have been done before, and would have helped perhaps Terry McAuliffe win last week. Which, by the way, I campaigned hard for him, worked very hard, and was disappointed. But I think it's indicative of the lack of bipartisanship, and maybe that was the goal, and it was accomplished because, it took a hard line. The Democrats had nothing to show for, except for the child tax credit, really, that anything that they had truly delivered on in an effective way, and that really hurt the election last week.
Hunter DeRensis, some other people have been making the point that bipartisan legislation, infrastructure is really the showpiece example of that usually. And the fact that really only 13 Republicans crossed lines, plus the squad going the other way, shows that actually maybe bipartisanship really is dead. What do you think?
I think it's fair to describe this bill as bipartisan in the sense that even though it's only a minority of Republicans who voted for the bill, infrastructure as a topic still gets positive credibility in the media. It's always positively described. It's always something that's said as, oh, well, we need to deal with infrastructure. And I think that's the reason that the bill finally passed, because the only things that get passed bipartisanly in Washington, D.C. are things that benefit Washington, D.C. I think when the American people hear the term $1.2 trillion infrastructure plan, the only thing that should occur to them is a smorgasbord of pork. The fact is that the federal government should only be responsible for taking care of the interstate highway system and other things that fall directly under the federal government. And frankly, the interstate highway system is in fine working order. The truth is, and this rarely gets described, is that 90% of infrastructure in this country, that's sewer, water, roads, buses, subways, etc., are handled at the local and state level. And that's where these things should be handled. If there is a problem in infrastructure in a community, whether that's a city, a county, or a state, it should be the responsibility and the civic duty of people who live there to decide this is a problem, this is what we're going to do about it, and this is how we're going to pay for it. When you get Capitol Hill involved and the federal government decides we're going to take $1.2 trillion from the taxpayers nationally and decide how that's distributed, it just opens you up for enormous amounts of graft. And eventually that money is going to go to places where it's not needed, because we can't trust Washington, D.C. to make these decisions. It should be the local and state officials and communities who are deciding what their infrastructure needs are, not Washington, D.C.
If I could jump in there, I mean, having covered Congress for longer than I want to admit, the federal government is not making these decisions, and the money's coming in this case largely from the federal government. But the congressional delegations in every state, they take recommendations from their local and state officials, and so it is local. It is needs generated from localities, mayors, city councilmen, state heads of transportation departments. They're the ones that recommend these projects and come up with lists that the federal government largely follows. Also, the federal gas tax, I have to make a little correction to what was just said, because the federal gas tax is earmarked specifically for infrastructure and for far more than just interstate. Bridges, for instance, many of which, hundreds of which, if not thousands in this country, are unsafe and have contributed to fatalities. We all travel beyond where we live. We cross state lines, we drive across the country, everything's opening up now. So it's not true that the federal government is not supposed to be involved in infrastructure building.
Okay, so those are the logistics of how it works. Hunter, one more on the political front,
Mm-hmm.
do you think that progressives in Washington have maybe, they being a little naive, trusting that Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are going to be on board for this broader spending package that most Democrats want to pass?
I think calling the progressives naive in that case would, it assumes that they believe Sinema and Manchin are actually going to favor that bill, which I just don't see happening. And I think most progressives realize that at this point. And I think it's why you saw the divergence between the infrastructure bill and the wider bill that they were originally enwrapped in. I think really by separating them, the progressives are admitting defeat, that they can't hope to pass everything they wanted, and that they'd rather take the infrastructure bill as is because it's better than nothing from their perspective.
Indeed. And that topic of Senator Joe Manchin brings us on nicely to our next topic, actually, because he had something to say this week about inflation. Because this week, new numbers on inflation ignited concerns from economists and the general public.
Consumers across the U.S. are feeling the squeeze.
I think I just filled my car up for like $50, $55, something like that. It's really expensive.
It's the result of surging inflation. Prices are up 6.2% compared to last year, a rise not seen since 1990.
74 bucks.
The cost for gas has gone up month after month.
It's probably like 25-30% more. And, I could use that savings to do other things.
Grocery prices are way up too.
I used to shop based on what I like. Now I shop based on price and what I can afford.
Experts point to the pandemic for causing disruptions in the global supply chain. There are shortages in raw materials and labor. Ports backed up with shipping containers waiting to be released. All this as demand for goods is sky high.
This is a recipe for delays and for higher prices.
Today, President Biden said addressing inflation is a top priority. He committed to stabilize the supply chain, allowing funding for ports to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
So, Hunter DeRensis, we've just talked about a political victory for Joe Biden. Does this inflation concern threaten to derail all of that?
I think it does, because inflation is a problem that the average American can see every day. And I think the only positive aspect that can possibly come out of this inflationary spiral is that monetary policy, I hope, is going to be discussed more, because frankly, in policy circles, our monetary policy in this country is never discussed, and people never mention the Federal Reserve, despite the fact that that's what created this crisis in the first place. Last year, the Federal Reserve created more money in a shorter period of time than in any other period in American history. We're talking about the creation of trillions of dollars instantaneously over a period of months. Of course, we're seeing the effects of that through massive inflation throughout the entire economy. And the fact is that inflation is a tax on the poor and working class, and it's a pernicious tax because so often it's hard to see where exactly that comes from. It's often a silent tax. And despite being a tax on the working class, it's often to the benefit of Wall Street investment firms and people who play the stock market, who are happy to see prices go up. It's simply benefiting the higher class and big business at the expense of the poor. And I hope that as people see their prices go up, whether that's at the grocery store or at the pump, the American people stand up and start asking, what has government done to our money? And the answer to that is it's devalued that beyond belief. And we need to start looking for solutions to that. And I think the first thing to do with that would be to abolish the Federal Reserve and return to a real sound currency that's not based just on a government promise.
Rachel Vindman, your view there?
I would find, and rather than abolishing the Federal Reserve, I would like to find some more practical solutions to the issues right now. So part of the inflation issue we know is a supply chain problem. It's affecting goods being able to get to where they need to go. Interestingly, I've been in the UK for about 10 days now, had several, instances of talking to people, and they all talk about the supply chain problem, but their problem is caused by Brexit, and ours is caused by COVID, or actually President Biden, if you ask some. So I find, I guess, the thing that bothers you the most is caused by the thing that you hate the most. And there doesn't seem to be like an actual rational connection. So there was a really interesting piece, I don't know if y'all read it, by Ryan Johnson, a 20-year truck driver, recently, that he sort of lays out the problem. And the problem in a lot of ways, I know I'm conservative, but I'm a capitalist, but sometimes the government has to step in and be realistic about capitalism. And really this is like kind of capitalism unhinged, because right now there's no motivation for, we have actually supplies. It's not, the problem isn't availability in a lot of cases. It's that there's tremendous money to be made in transporting goods right now. And there's no reason to hire more people or train more people, because they can just raise the price and make the people who are working now can make more money. So what I think there should be some kind of, we need to look at this from limited, I would say, but from a regulatory standpoint, or the people, the government, we have to decide as a people which way do we want to go. And this is the constant debate that we seem to be having. There's the people who don't want government to be involved in any way, but they complain about things, like inflation, that's really caused by a secondary issue. So for now, I think we really need to address the supply chain problem in the US, which is probably only going to be done by regulation, which again is not my wheelhouse. It's not what I prefer, but we have seen through extreme circumstances that COVID created that this is a weakness in our system.
So, James Rosen, we've heard everything from let's abolish the Federal Reserve to a conservative urging more government action, which I'm surprised about. So what's your thinking on this, your solutions? And to get back to our question, how much does this threaten Joe Biden's political future?
I do want to push back at the claim a few minutes ago that we have massive inflation. We don't have massive inflation. We don't have anything close to massive inflation. I lived through the 70s. I think I'm older than my other panelists here, under Jimmy Carter. That was massive inflation. I remember inflation 20%, 30%. The Washington Post published a series of charts yesterday in a very interesting down the middle article. And one of them showed month over month increases in all prices this year over last year. October hit 6.2%, was the first time. Previous few months were about 5%, 5.5%. Couple months before that, 4%. So we're kind of creeping up month by month, 4%, 5%, 6%. But I have to tell you that 6% is not massive inflation. It's inflation. And I think, Americans, as we often are, and I'll include myself here, I don't like spending more. I think we're spoiled, because I think the Federal Reserve has artificially for years, if not decades, taken steps to keep inflation down. And during the pandemic, they've been less able to do that. But the bottom line is, 6% inflation, which again is only October, first month that we hit 6% year over year. That's not massive inflation.
Hunter DeRensis, let's come back to you on that then. It's James has given us the history lesson and saying that 6.2 is nothing compared to 20% or more, but it is the highest rate in 30 years. So should we be more worried than James is?
It is the highest rate in several decades, and I would challenge James on some of the definitional things. There is such a thing as price inflation, which is just the cost of goods going up, and then there is just overall inflation, which is simply an increase in the supply of money. And last year, we saw the increase in the supply of US dollars increase by trillions, and you cannot increase the supply of money by that degree and not see the corresponding price of money not change. So yes, we have had massive inflation in the sense of there are trillions of more US dollars in the economy. And now, a year hence, we are starting to see the influx of prices and the effects of that, partially from that inflation and partially from the supply shortages that Rachel touched on. I think it's important to keep in, and I actually would agree with him in the point that the Federal Reserve has heavily manipulated the US economy, and it's what drives our boom bust cycles of cyclical crises, recessions, depressions, and then false recoveries. But I certainly disagree that anything the Federal Reserve is doing is tapping down on inflation, when in fact all of the Fed's policies over the past century have in fact devalued the dollar and encouraged that inflationary spiral.
Okay, well, thank you all for that. Let's move on to our final full topic, and it's another story making the headlines this week. It was when a federal judge blocked the Biden administration's vaccine mandate for large employers. And here's the story from 10 News in Tampa, Florida.
A coalition of groups went to court on Friday arguing the Biden administration vaccine mandate is unconstitutional. On December 5th, companies with 100 or more employees would have to force unvaccinated workers to wear masks indoors, and workers would have until January 4th to get vaccinated or face weekly testing. Millions of employees at nursing homes, hospitals, and other facilities receiving money from Medicare and Medicaid would also be required to get vaccinated, with no exemptions except for medical and religious reasons.
So, Rachel Vindman, this judge's decision, is it a death knell for the vaccine requirements or just a bump in the road?
You know, I mean, that remains to be seen. I find a lot of this debate, people were told what to think, and a lot of the outrage, I believe, is faux outrage. That being said, you know, my experience, and I asked a few friends about this that work for large corporations, some in pretty conservative areas where, you know, one was a hospital. They recently came down with the vaccine mandate, and my friend is a nurse. She only has 2 colleagues who aren't vaccinated. They're going through a legal process to try to, you know, not have to get an exception. The others who are vaccinated are absolutely irate at the vaccine mandate, but they're vaccinated. So, you know, I wish that this wasn't necessary. I understand why the Biden administration has taken this this point of view. Right now, COVID cases are going down. You know, and we've been able, I have a 10-year-old, so, you know, we've been able to get vaccines for the 5 to 11 age group. I think we'll continue to see cases go down. I really don't understand why we need a vaccine mandate, a federal vaccine mandate, when it looks like things are getting better. If things get worse, that's always a card that can be played.
But I want to remind everybody, I think a lot of people don't know what OSHA stands for. OSHA stands for Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And their job is to keep the public healthy, especially in the workplace. And if requiring people to get vaccines during a pandemic when something like 1/3 of Americans have refused to get vaccines that they easily could have gotten, if that's not the core mission of OSHA, I don't know what is.
Hunter, I can see you're dying to jump in here. Isn't that the key point, that this is about the right of workers not to have an unvaccinated person next to them and getting them sick?
I don't think you have the right to make medical decisions for other people, but honestly, yes, I don't believe you have that right. But Adam, I'd like to really push back on something. Adam, I'd like to really push back on something.
How can you defend that view? How can you defend that view? That is really something. These are
what's really something? What's really something?
That are individual medical decisions, really?
Yes, it is an individual medical decision. I'm a believer in bodily autonomy, and no, I don't believe that under any circumstances your natural rights can be infringed upon. That's why they're natural rights imbued by our humanity.
People's natural rights to shoot other people. Why not let people shoot other people? That's a natural right.
You do not have a natural right to aggress against people. And James, I would love to have an in-depth discussion about the non-aggression principle, natural rights, and what is inherent in humanity and what the government should not be able to infringe upon. But I'd really like to push back on something, Adam, you actually said, which I think is an important point, which is that these mandates can actually be effective. I think it is a brilliant opportunity currently for states to reassert their sovereignty and really make sure the federal government cannot have a say in this. The fact is that OSHA, which is the government agency that the Biden administration has tasked to enforce these vaccine mandates. They have less than 2,000 inspectors in the entire country. And these less than 2,000, about 1,800 inspectors, are tasked with enforcing a mandate on 130 million American workers in 8 million job sites.
That's an argument for having more OSHA.
If these receive any pushback whatsoever, or non-cooperation from the states, then they can't enforce the federal mandate. I think it would be a brilliant idea for other states to follow Florida's lead currently, convene state legislatures, and have local elected representatives say that we, within the borders of our state, are not going to enforce this unconstitutional executive order, or have the legislature pass something saying that we are banning vaccine mandates within our state. And then at the very least, you can have businesses attempt to decide between whether they're going to try to follow federal law or state law. I think it's an excellent thing to bring up the point of nullification and reassert state sovereignty over these issues.
Well, I just want to say that I was a history major at Berkeley. I know a lot.
So was I.
At Berkeley?
George Mason University.
George Mason, good school. Okay, I've read American history extensively. States have a miserable record when it comes to protecting civil rights. Madison wrote about this. When it comes to protecting civil rights, when it comes to protecting the environment, when it comes to preventing the abuse of child laborers, across the board, they have a miserable record. So to argue—
Is that why northern states nullified the fugitive slave law in the 1850s and prevented the kidnapping of Black people back to the South? Was that a terrible enforcement of civil rights?
You can cherry pick, but—
Oh, cherry pick by bringing up a counterexample to what you just said? Okay, James.
Well, I named 3 broad areas of American life. You focused on one specific point in time where—
Okay, another
Abraham
point.
Lincoln made up
states reasserting their point to not send their National Guard troops into unconstitutional and undeclared wars, or wars that they think are against the national interest. I think that's quite an impressive standard for state sovereignty.
And on that point, I can actually see that we have a viewer question coming up that sort of touches on that. So we'll get to that in a second, but let's take another viewer question first, just to get a quick change of topic. And we go to Pearl Pearson, who asks, how do conservatives and libertarians want to pay for infrastructure? If the government doesn't pay for it, then who does? And Hunter, I think you were touching on this earlier.
Under our current system, I am a natural decentralist, so I would prefer if states pay for things over the federal government. I'd prefer cities pay for things over states. Under our current system, I think if you can get it to the lowest denomination where people have the most choice, the most say in those decisions, and the democratic voice of the people is heard the loudest, I think that's a good thing. Personally, I think there are many private solutions to all of this, but currently, if I'm going to be practical for a moment, I favor just putting it at the smallest political unit possible.
So why don't we move on and talk about what our guests think the most underreported story of the week is. And I can see you all shuffling for your papers. Who would like to go first?
So Frank Kendall III was confirmed as the United States Secretary of the Air Force, appointed by Joe Biden back in July. And it was just recently that Kendall released hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of stock in the defense contractor Leidos, where he formerly served on the board. And this is not getting reported really at all. And I think it speaks as just a microcosm of a larger problem, because Kendall, during his short tenure so far, has advocated much closer collaboration between military contractors and weapons dealers and the Department of Defense. And I think it says something that these sort of incestuous relationships, where someone can serve on the board of a company and then go back to work for the Department of Defense and make these deals related to the Pentagon budget, and then I'm certain when their tenure is over, go back into the private sector and reap the rewards of this. I think it goes to the problems of what we call the military industrial complex, and how the taxpayers, and frankly, American people in general, are getting taken for a ride by this deplorable system.
Hunter and I finally agree on something.
Oh,
yes,
me too.
Yeah, I know our guests don't normally jump in, but I can tell you, for those of you who are listening, that there was lots of nodding going on there as Hunter was telling us
You're
about
speaking
that.
my language about
Yeah.
We'll have to discuss more foreign policy on the next panel.
James, you were going to jump in with your story. Why don't you go ahead now?
Well, in Virginia, Albemarle County, which is where the great University of Virginia, one of the top public universities in the country, is located. Charlottesville is the biggest city and the capital of Albemarle. Police there have started. Hunter might like this. This is county police and city police have started a crackdown on distracted driving. And in the first week, they issued 146 citations. And I read an article that had some, and you know, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I have never used my cell phone while I was driving. I don't want to be like, I don't want to pull an Aaron Rodgers. So, you know, in some ways I'm as guilty as the next. I try to reduce it. But I read an article that had some really disturbing figures for Virginia, a very large state, that in 2020 alone, there were 124 automobile accident fatalities directly attributed to cell phone use, and that 20% of all car-related injuries in Virginia now are related to using cell phones. So the state of Maryland has banned using them while driving. The state of Virginia, being a generally more conservative state, has not. But Albemarle County now, in Virginia, large county in Virginia, is cracking down.
Rachel, why don't you bring us home then with your most underreported story of the week?
Sean Parnell, who is a Republican candidate for Senate in Pennsylvania, this week had a great actually teaching moment for me with my daughter, just to remind her, although I'm pretty sure she already knew, unlike Mr. Parnell, because he said it used to be, you know, women were attracted to your strength because you could defend them from dinosaurs. Now, for all our listeners, I do just need to remind you, humans and dinosaurs did not live at the same time. But, you know, this just blatant toxic masculinity is constant. And I'm not one who talks about that a lot, but it's so in your face.
But that's all we have time for this week. Thank you to our guests, James Rosen, Rachel Vindman, and Hunter DeRensis. And thank you for watching or listening, whichever one you've been doing, to The Square Circle. I'm Adam Bearne, and we'll see you next week.